I think it's important to be grounded in one's identity and speak to it to validate a point. Where it gets a little tricky is if you're not open to understanding that there might be a multiplicity of experiences and opinions. If you are not open to understanding that your one way of looking at it might be narrow at some level. So I think a lot of that is about self-growth and self-analysis and self-reflection that everyone has to do, including organizers and movement leaders, regardless of how urgent the situation is that's in front of us.
Hello, friends. My name is Gibrán Rivera. I'm a facilitator, and this is my podcast. Here, I'm bringing you into a conversation with remarkable leaders who are devoting their lives to the evolution of consciousness and culture. In this episode, I introduce you to my friend, the author Deepa Iyer. Deepa is an activist and a thought leader committed to real solidarity work. I have been blessed and lucky to work with her over the last 5 years in the Solidarity Summit series. And in this episode, you'll learn about the building blocks of solidarity and about the importance of working together, even as we hold many different perspectives. It is a good episode. I can't wait for you to hear it, and I can't wait for you to get to know Deepa. Deepa, how are you? It is so good to have you on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this.
Thank you so much for having me, Gibrán. It's a real honor.
Yes, I'm very, very excited for this conversation and for my listeners to get to know you better. I want to talk a little bit about all the ways in which we know each other, and maybe you can fill them out further for me. But if I remember correctly, I met you at a Ford Foundation thing back in like 2008. It was Bonnie Jenkins doing something on engaging unheard voices in foreign policy. You were the executive director of SALT at the time. Am I correct?
I was. Yes, you have a fabulous memory. That is right. I do remember that meeting.
And well, that was a big breakthrough facilitation moment for me.
Oh, really? Is that right?
It was my really big client, in terms of to go into a foundation as a client, and so that's why I remember it so well.
Okay.
Because it was a moment, and you were there. You were there.
Yeah.
And over the last couple of years, we've been collaborating on the Solidarity Summit series, which I'm sure we'll get into as well.
That's great. Yes.
But I would rather give you a chance to tell us how you define your work, what you're doing, what you're excited about, and then we can circle back around to the ways in which we're collaborating.
Yeah, definitely. Well, wow, that was a long time ago. I'm glad that you reminded us of it. So I would say that I am a movement strategist, facilitator, and a media creator in different ways. So my work has taken, I think, a lot of different shapes over the past 2 decades. But I've been trained as a lawyer and primarily worked at Asian American and South Asian American organizations that do civil rights work. And as you mentioned, I served as a director of SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, for a decade, which we founded and shaped in the post 9/11 moment when our communities were going through a lot of harm. I left SALT in 2014, and since then, I have been doing a range of things. I wrote a book on post 9/11 America. I have also been organizing as you mentioned, a project around multiracial solidarity. And part of that has been these summits that we have been co-facilitating and working on together. I also work on a rapid response project that looks at how Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities are being targeted in this current moment in our country and how we can respond to defend our communities and protect our communities. So that's a range of the work that I do in terms of strategizing, facilitating training, as well as writing and advocating. Sadly, there's no one word that describes it.
Beautiful.
So I always end up being having to explain it in a long way. So I apologize for that.
Yeah, no, I am very, very familiar with how challenging it is to describe what we do. And as far as the people
Yeah.
listening are concerned, I just think of you as somebody that's committed their lives to the evolution of consciousness and
See, you
culture.
said it a lot better.
Right, right when it matters
Mm,
most. This idea of multiracial solidarity, right? In a moment, in a historical moment when virulent
mhm.
white supremacy is expressed all the ways to the top of our government,
Yeah.
right? It is such a moment in which the very pillars that the country has been founded on are like shaking, and to get to talk to somebody that's deciding to like engage that directly, I think is exciting
Mm,
and quite an honor for me. So thank you.
thank you.
Thank you for your work. And so there's so many things I want to ask you about, but can you talk a little bit? Can you describe one more layer of this multiracial solidarity
Yeah.
work, which is it's the point in which we intersect? But how could a lay person understand that better?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing to keep in mind is that we've always engaged in some form of solidarity practice as human beings, whether it's helping out a neighbor or writing a letter to the editor or showing up for another community. But I think in this particular moment, as you mentioned, multiracial solidarity is really critical and vital. And so, what does it look like? In the movement arena, what it looks like is that one, communities understand each other's histories and their unique experiences as people of color, as immigrants, as Indigenous people in the United States. And then, secondly, that we break out of our silos. I think in many ways, and I think this is part of white supremacist culture, we in movement spaces, organizational spaces, are just working with these blinders on. We're working for our cause,
Yeah.
we're working for our X community, we're working in this area. And because of this feeling of scarcity and under resourced communities, we're not really able to make the connections between our communities. So, the simple thing is that when we use solidarity as a strategy, we can win. We can build power for our communities. We can learn about each other in a much deeper way than in a superficial manner. So it's really about what are our shared values? What are our goals? How do we make change for all of us? To make sure that we have a more equitable community and society.
That's great. That is beautiful. I know that from the work that we do together at Solidarity Summit, one of the things that we talk about a lot is how um, there is anti-blackness, right, among migrant groups, and there's Islamophobia among Black people, right, and there is anti-migrant concerns among it's like all of us hold the same prejudices against each other, even though they're
Right.
being wielded against us, right? And I think
Yes.
that I often see your work at trying
Mm-hmm.
to sift through that so that we can actually stand together, right, for something greater.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think part of it is that we're very good at, I think, this transactional solidarity, right? So I'll come to your rally and you can sign on to my statement. We do that well. But what is harder is some of this work that you mentioned, where there are tensions between communities. So, for example, if there is anti Black racism within South Asian or Asian American communities, that can then prevent these communities from standing together on, say, police brutality or immigration. So part of solidarity work is actually the messiness of it is what is key. It is messy, it is discordant, it doesn't make sense all the time, and it is very long term because it's about trust building and relationship building and learning about each other. And so part of it is actually undoing what you said, these biases and these assumptions that we are holding against each other because they're also tearing us apart and making it easier for systemic racism to actually wield itself against all of us.
That is so powerful and so relevant. What is coming to my mind is just yesterday, by chance, I was talking to a dear friend of mine and thought partner. Her name is Cindy Suarez. She's the first person I interviewed on this podcast, actually. And
Oh.
she's got another book out, a good book out called the Power Manual. But I digress. She was talking just yesterday to me about looking at solidarity and looking at movements and looking at Poland, right? Where like
Hmm.
the Polish uprising was called solidarity, right? Like that is the movement. And one of the things that you said and that I wanted to ask you about is that, like you said, it was long term, but that new norms were formed every step of the way, right?
Hmm.
That people started to come together in ways that were different from what was sanctioned, right, under the kind of Polish Soviet regime, right?
Hmm.
And uh, and some of it included remembering things from before that, right? But this establishment of new norms of kind of creating an almost its own subculture was integral
Hmm. Hmm.
to the development of something new. And I'm wondering if that's something that you see in the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Because I think that in one way, we are all looking for this big win, right? Like we get rid of the Muslim ban or we pass, immigration legislation that is equitable and fair. And those are big wins. But as you mentioned, there are a lot of immediate changes that actually reflect how we interact with each other, the dynamics between organizations and movement leaders. And so some of those changes that I've seen, which create these new norms, is for example, instead of making an assumption about an organization, to literally pick up the phone and make a call,
So simple.
right? So simple, but it's something that we don't do because it's easier to send out a tweet to say something negative, or to before you weigh in on an issue to actually think and ask yourself, how could my position on um, asylum seekers at the border affect people who are also seeking temporary protected status, right? Asking like these multiple layers of questions, because oftentimes we tend to compromise on policy issues because we have the siloed approach. So some of the smaller changes with the new norms that you talked about that I've seen is this relationship building, thinking very deeply about how certain issues can affect multiple communities, not just your own, and making clear decisions based on that analysis. Even communities coming into relationship with each other that they wouldn't necessarily do normally. So town halls where you have Muslim and Black communities come together, South Asian Muslim communities and Black Muslim communities, for example, coming together, or conversations around anti-Black racism in Asian American communities, even things like that that I think don't not necessarily happen when you're in the midst of a campaign. These are the small, but I think transformative new norms that you mentioned that really shape the dynamics of how we interact.
That's awesome. That's cool. I love the very specific things, right? Like instead of doing this, do this, right? I think sometimes people we
Yeah.
get into like the philosophical aspects of like, let's all be together, let's all like, but this idea of like pick up the phone when you're making an assumption about an organization,
Hmm.
it can get us so much farther, right? I want to get into the because I feel like it gets to the human part, and I'm really curious and interested in the human part of this work, right? Like I think your ideas are brilliant, your book is awesome, right? And I want to know more about the spirit and the person behind it. But I
Mm.
think a way into it might be by asking about the rapid response work, because I feel like that work is so important, but it can be so taxing to
Yeah.
the well-being of the intervener. So give me a couple of words about what that work looks like, and then we'll talk more about how you survive in it.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's typical frontline responder work. So it's that moment where you mobilize, where
Yeah.
you see an issue or a problem and you make an intervention. And oftentimes you have to think on your feet, you have to marshal a lot of networks and resources together and make quick decisions. And it's also very taxing, as you said,
Yeah.
because it's connected to people that I care about deeply.
Well, you were the first person that I heard from after outside of the news from after El Paso.
Mm.
Like you know what I mean? Like the email from you was the first kind of comprehensive thing that landed on my desk. Um, so that means you kind of gotta hear those news, withstand the human impact of them, and then kind of turn around and do something useful with it. How does your spirit handle that?
Yeah. I think I have gotten better at it using some techniques.
Mhm.
It took me some time to recognize that I was actually really absorbing the weight of the direct and vicarious trauma of the post 9/11 environment.
Right.
And for me, that moment came actually in 2012 when there was a massacre at a Sikh place of worship right outside Milwaukee that I'm sure your listeners have all heard about, at the Sikh temple there. And when that happened, I realized I was experiencing a lot of things. I was experiencing numbness. I was experiencing a sense of fear. I was experiencing exhaustion. But at the same time, I was working throughout it,
Mhm.
right? I went down to the community. I helped put out press releases. I talked to community members. I talked to survivors. And my book actually begins with a chapter on that community. So I also, though, realized in intervening years that I wasn't actually withstanding the impact. And so I left my organization for a range of reasons, but that was one of them as well. But how I withstand it now is that I've actually, I know this might sound a little bit odd, but I've come to terms with the fact that I am decently good at being a frontline responder, and that it is part and parcel of my set of skills. And I've also come to terms with understanding that I have to come in and out of it, and that I don't have to always be the one responding. So I've identified groups
Mhm.
of people who are all in that same kind of position and that can take on the lead, make a statement, put together a list of resources, etc. So understanding that the weight of it doesn't have to, I don't have to feel responsible alone, that there's a community of people I can
Right.
connect with, and that I have to come in and out of it has really helped me.
That's powerful. I love what I'm hearing underneath what you're saying, and it's part of a personal bias, but the whole idea that whatever the problem, community is the answer,
Yes, that's so
right?
true.
You're relying on others, right? You're doing things
Yeah.
together. Um, and so, Deepa, am I right to know that to think that you came from India, like you weren't born in the mainland United States?
No, I moved here when I was 12.
Oh, that's I moved here at that same age.
I know. I know.
We
Every
have
time you say that, I think, oh, yes, me too.
what a tough time to move. I feel like
Oh,
you're not quite a kid, you're not
awful.
quite a teenager. It's a whole
You're an
thing.
adolescent.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. You moved to Boston, right?
yes.
So I moved to Kentucky.
Okay, okay,
Um,
okay. Wow.
yeah. Yeah.
Well, I want to hear about that. I mean, just to be correct, we moved to Western Massachusetts, but it was still Massachusetts. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
there was such a thing as being Puerto Rican. It wasn't well looked upon. There was an immediate feeling of
Hmm.
being othered and being seen as bad or as less than, for sure. Hard
Yeah.
thing to adjust to. But I'm wondering, what was it like to be a 12-year-old brown girl in Kentucky?
It was it was probably as difficult as you could imagine it to be, right? I think that for me, I immediately felt like I was an outsider. Having been in a country where everyone looked like me and spoke the same language as I did, and had similar cultural experiences, to being in a place where I was literally an outsider. I had a very thick accent, and so I spent a lot of time trying to eliminate it. Just like many immigrant children went through a lot of bullying and teasing at school, didn't feel like I was connected to a community at all. And there was a very small community here in Louisville where, Indian Americans were slowly kind of settling, but it was very, very small. So it was a feeling of isolation and
Hmm.
exclusion, and it definitely informed, I think, a lot of my future ideas and viewpoints.
I'm definitely want to pick up that thread, and I gotta confess, I did wonder about your accent and lack thereof, right?
Oh,
Because I
really?
feel like by the time you're 12, your accents can be etched in place, right? And it looks like it sounds like you managed your way out of it somehow. I was in Louisville for the first time I earlier this year
Mm,
doing some work with artists there. I was there for the Rolling Thunder, which I didn't know. Didn't know I was gonna be there for that, but I guess it's the biggest fireworks
yeah.
thing in the
Yes.
nation.
Yes.
So
No, it's
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's a the community has really changed over the years, and it's very different now than it was in the mid '80s. It's a lot more diverse. There's a lot of activism in the community as well, but certainly, it was a difficult place to grow up if you are a brown skinned girl with an accent and um, different immigration status and all of that. But my parents still live there,
So you get back.
of course.
And so did you kind of leave Louisville to go to school? And do you have social justice in your mind already, or did you kind of come up on that later?
I would say that it wasn't necessarily as fully fledged, and fully formed. I think that I was really interested in community formation. So even when I went to college,
Hmm.
I helped to start the first Indian American Students Association on the campus and served in various offices with that organization because I really understood the importance of coming together and having a community of people where we could connect with each other. I also
Right.
was really, I went to Vanderbilt University, which in Nashville, Tennessee, which is a very, at the time was not very diverse. And so got involved with campus efforts on diversity in the curriculum and the faculty and the like. So I wouldn't necessarily say, I wouldn't have called those things social justice, but to me, they were about equity and fairness and opportunity and community. And I think that those values have stayed with me.
And did you move from there into our sort of work, or did you kind of go into some kind of professional field?
No, I was very, yeah. I mean, I was pretty, I wish that I had done, what they do now, like gap years and things like that. But no, I just went straight to law school and then I started practicing law and then found myself into the nonprofit sector very quickly, primarily working with Asian American civil rights
Got you.
organizations.
I'm gonna ask you a question, and you can kind of check me or guide me if it's not appropriate. But I know from talking to my other Asian friends, whether they be East Asian or South Asian, they grapple a lot with kind of how they're perceived by dominant culture, as well as how their own communities self-conceive, right? So you are people of color, right? For sure, and you're
Hmm.
certainly othered, right? But often seen as kind of more
Hmm.
better behaved minorities, if you will, or sometimes your own communities have a more clearly defined right wing, right? Or this kind of thing where I know from being in community
Hmm.
with you, you hold a certain set of values that really can't be assumed of like South
Mm.
Asian people. And I'm wondering if you can elucidate that for me, if I'm incorrect, or if you
Yeah.
can help me
No,
maintain that.
I think that there's a sense that Asian Americans are sort of the model minority in this country, that there's a level of exceptionalism, right? And we see that, for example, when you think of how everything from like spelling bee champions who invariably turn out to be South Asian every single year to Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. So there is this sense of, well, this is a community that doesn't need any assistance. This is a community that, you know, makes its way regardless of being othered or being immigrants. And I think that part of the real dilemma with that is number one, it's not true, right? It masks a lot of the disparities and inequities within our communities on a range of reasons. And that's one of the most important things I think to remember, that Asian Americans, like any other community, are dealing with levels of poverty, education access, job training, healthcare access, you name it, right? Mental health issues. And then secondly, this goes back to our solidarity conversation, that this idea of exceptionalism with Asian Americans is really a racial wedge, because what it says is,
Mhm.
hey, what the message is actually to Black and Latinx people to say, well, look, if Asian Americans can make it, and if they're this successful, what about you? What's wrong with you? Why do you need affirmative action? Why are you asking for any sort of assistance, right? And so what we have been able to do, I think, and this is longstanding, is really make sure that we unpack this model minority myth and make sure that people outside of our communities, as well as people inside, because there are people inside who perpetuate it too, don't use it. Don't use this idea of exceptionalism, that we're different or better or superior, because it really does create these fissures between us and other communities of color.
Powerful, powerful, um, and important. It is really interesting the way these wedges are built. You know what I mean? And
Mm-hmm.
also like the other thing, which I was talking to Rinku about this when we
Mm,
were last together, actually. How we also want to be careful with essentializing people, right? Like sometimes even to build solidarity or to create or to articulate a political stance, we might say this is what it means to be Latinx, right? As if it's something essential, forgetting that
right.
30% of Latinos voted for Trump, even though he came out the
Wow.
gate calling us rapists, right? Like,
Wow. Mm,
I think there's something important to hold in these complexities, even as we bring identity
mhm.
to the fore, to really understand that essentializing any of us is actually a disservice to what we're trying
I absolutely
to achieve,
agree.
which is to be fully human together.
Yeah. And like you said, there's tremendous diversity within our communities around all sorts of lines. And to say this is the South Asian voice, or this is the Latinx voice, or opinion, right, is really a disservice. And we have to be really careful with the language that we use.
And you and I have been in plenty of spaces together, and I'm sure not together, where somebody will start any statement with, as a Latinx person, da, 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 as a,
Right.
which is, I think is both a valid stance, but also
Hmm.
want to like be able to poke holes at, because at the same, on the one hand we're saying, don't ask me to hold the opinion for all of my people. On the other hand, we're saying, hey, this is the opinion of all of my people.
Right.
It's an
Right.
interesting thing that we do.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. I mean, I think it's important to be grounded in one's identity and to
Yeah.
utilize that and speak to it, to validate a point or to acknowledge something that is happening. I think where it gets a little tricky is if you're not open to understanding that there might be a multiplicity of experiences and opinions, and if you are not open to understanding that your one way of looking at it might be narrow at some level. So I think a lot of that is about self growth and self analysis and self reflection that everyone has to do, including organizers and movement leaders, regardless of how
That's right.
urgent the situation is that's in front of
That's
us,
exactly right.
the crisis that's in front of us.
Deepa, one of the things that keeps coming to mind, and I think there's probably a way to put the PDF in the show notes.
Okay.
There's this chart that you've been using that points to the different kind of archetypes in
Mm.
is it organizing archetypes, or is it movement archetypes
The
that
roles.
has like the heel? Yeah, can you describe that a little bit for us? Because I think that is so useful, and I actually seen other people sharing it. I'm like, hey, I know the person behind that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like it's a pretty simple description of the roles, the various roles that we see in our movement ecosystems. But I agree that maybe the simplicity of it has people have resonated with it and they use it, which I'm really happy with. But basically, it goes through various roles that people play, right? So we talked about, in my sense, that I tend to play the role of the frontline responder, that's something that I do. But there are others, of course, who play the role of healers or bridge builders. There are people who are organizers or who are caregivers to a movement. Maybe you're somebody who actually doesn't get involved in the rally, but you're bringing water to the organizers who are, right? So you're a caregiver in that way. So it just identifies these various buckets. There are many more than the ones that I wrote up, but it identifies these various buckets. And I think the point of it is that we don't have to play all these roles. That even if the moment is urgent and the crisis is really clear, that we don't have to play every single role, and that we can actually map out who is part of our ecosystem. Right. So, and I mentioned that earlier, for me, it's been really important to understand that while I see myself as a frontline responder, there are other people in my ecosystem that I can lean on. So the point is, how do you see yourself? Where do you want to maybe move into, learn more about, become? And who else is part of this movement ecosystem? Who else is playing other roles? So it's a way to reflect and analyze yourself as well as an organization or a group of people that you're working with.
Awesome. And do you see some roles that are overplayed and some roles that are underplayed? There's as a general. I mean, it doesn't have to be like a scientific take, but in the spaces that you're in, are there? Does it seem well balanced, or are people all doing more of one thing?
That is a really good question. I think that when I have used this exercise with various groups, what I see is a dearth of maybe storytellers and artists, right? They exist, of course, but they might not be connected to our movements in the ways that they could be. So there's a siloing effect there. I also see a dearth of people who are healers. So people who are able to actually talk about and attend to the trauma that folks might be facing in an ecosystem. So I think that's an excellent question. And I would say that, of course, like, we need more people playing all of these roles, but those are two arenas where I've seen a bit of a gap.
I asked you the question with the intention of digging into the healer bit, especially knowing that we both see so much trauma in the work that we're doing. But I do want to pause and before we go there and ask about the storytellers. And I'll tell you where my question's coming from, which is, there's a lot of like narrative work going on right now, right? From like a communications perspective, which I don't think is a bad thing. And I do think more people are claiming to do it than actually know how to do it, but we don't need to go there. But when I think about storytelling now, and I'm just wondering where you are with it, I think of ourselves as ancestors in training.
You always say that.
I think that a big reason why we end up where we are societally is because we have forgotten the ancestors, right? And so if you forget the ancestors, then you become the first society on the planet to steal from your descendants, right? Because you forget that you're part of a thread. And so the ancestors carry stories, right? Stories for how to survive when things get rough, right? Stories for how to be a good human being. Stories for how to take care of each other. Stories for how not to create a culture that is rich with loneliness, right? Even though it's also rich with stuff, right? And I'm just wondering, when you say storytellers, are you talking about what I just said? Are you talking about narrative strategists? Are you talking about something in between?
Yeah, no, I'm not actually talking about narrative strategists and people who are doing like communications polls and testing them. I'm actually talking about people who remember the histories of our communities and can share them. I'm talking about people who can use storytelling as a way to manifest what has happened to our communities and what is still happening to our community. So it's more of an artist than a strategist. And I do agree with you that that's really missing. I mean, I think that storytellers and artists exist, and cultural workers exist, obviously, right? But I think that connection between how they're integrated into our movement spaces, our movement decision making, or organizations happens just once in a while. It's not something that's actually connected as it should be.
Yeah, I've been for many years facilitating, and I just came back from facilitating creative change. This was the
Mm-hmm.
10th one, a gathering of artists and activists at Sundance, and
Mm-hmm.
a mantra that's often spoken there is, we don't want you to just call us to like make a poster for your campaign. We want to be part of the
Mm-hmm.
strategy, right? We want to help you think about what a cultural intervention looks like.
Mm.
Um, I appreciate your concern with artists, cultural workers, storytellers. I share it. I think that there is a medicine there that is really missing in a
You're
lot of the
right.
spaces that we're in, and even how we think about these spaces. Um, and I know also want to get into the healers piece, and I know, and actually it wouldn't be fair to name anyone that we're in community with, but we we have been blessed to work in spaces with amazing artists. I mean, not artists, amazing
Mm.
activists, right? That are leading some of the more important and relevant movements of our time. And we have both been also witness to how tired they can get, to
Mm-hmm.
how exhausted, how even, for lack of a better word, traumatized, right? How like burnt
Mm-hmm.
out. And I know that, so we'll be like facilitating something or designing something, and we just have to pause and account for what a big deal it is for these people to even get on a plane and come see us and be
Mm.
together, or how to create space for them to just relax, or these are things that we got to wrestle with,
Yeah.
because there's something about how we're doing the work that is killing us. And we could easily say there's something about our time, our historic time, that is killing us. I think that
Mm-hmm.
is also true. I'm not trying to deny that. But there is a dearth of healers, and a lot of need for healing and for medicine.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how you coming at that right now.
Yeah. So I think part of it is actually to acknowledge what you just said and to
Yeah.
acknowledge that it exists. So I recently also wrote something around movement culture and some of the characteristics in movement organizations that we see around this push towards productivity, right? Like produce, produce, produce. So you're constantly working to meet all these metrics that are set by philanthropy, or other accountability partners. There's this sense of personality, the cult of personality that I think has emerged even in our organizational spaces and our movements. So the number of Twitter followers you have and the way that you're showing up on social media has become so important because you're a quote influencer now, right? But then who are you accountable to? Who's informing your ideas, right? And do you then speak for an entire movement, sort of what we spoke about already? And then this idea of purity, movement purity, where, if you are not fully woke, you don't have your woke credentials from the moment you step into an organization or in a facilitation space, that you feel like something is wrong with you. Cancel
Yeah.
culture, call out culture, all of that, I think, is a consequence of this kind of idea of movement purity. So I think these trends, along with the urgency of the moment, along with the fact that we are in rapid response crises cycles, and the under resourcing of our causes and our organizations, really leads to a place where people are traumatized and people are hurt and people are fatigued and people need to heal. So I think it's
Yeah.
important to kind of think about what causes the what is causing the situation, what are the roots of it, and then of course how do we attend to folks that are in movement spaces.
That you just opened up so much, and I know this is a place where you and I have met and have wrestled with, not with each other so much, but with it together.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to get into the causes. I'm just wondering though, while we are in it, have you seen anything working at the level of healing and restoration for people.
Yeah,
That,
I have. I think so. I think
yeah.
part of it, yeah, I think part of it is having spaces in our organizations where people are actually talking about this, right? So, some examples have been where organizations are putting aside resources and time to have retreats where people are actually doing cleansing work, where they're doing work to talk about the trauma that they're enduring, right? So, having those kinds of opportunities to come together collectively has been important. Another piece has been where organizations are really clear that there needs to be support for people who choose to have mental health care or alternative health care. And setting aside resources or providing stipends so you can see a therapist or you can go to an acupuncturist or you can get whatever kind of healing that you need, right? So, actually integrating that into the organization's budget. A third is where there is actually an understanding that we can't keep going, right? And so organizations are integrating sabbaticals for their frontline staff. They're cycling people in and out of situations that are constantly in this place of urgent crisis response. So those are
Great.
just some examples of what I've seen that organizations are, I think, starting to be more attentive
Deepa,
about.
that's a much more exciting answer than I was expecting. Actually, when I asked the question, I'm glad you're seeing. I really, that's really good. I mean, there's more to go.
Well, I mean, it's not
Yeah,
across the board. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not across the board, and I think both philanthropy as well as organizations have to really grapple with this because what we're seeing, as you know, is a lot of burnout. We're seeing revolving doors and people leaving constantly our movement spaces, and we're not able
right.
to recruit people because folks know that they don't want to end up like the executive director of the organization, right? And so I think that it's not something that I think is happening. It's not a trend. It's an exception when you see these sorts of choices being made. But hopefully, the more we talk about it, the more organizations will understand that this is just as important, right, as bringing on a coach for your
Yeah.
leadership team, right? So that's what I hope we get to.
This is great. This is great. I was struck by the things that you delineated as part of movement culture. You know,
Mm,
I have reactions or thoughts about a number of them, but the productivity one caught my attention right away because as I think about healing and restoration and even evolution, growing, I think about some of the sacred medicine work that I'm involved in and that I help
mm,
people through as one of the more powerful healing spaces that I'm a part of. But it's interesting because, for example, in Silicon Valley, you can have people uh, microdosing some of these medicines for sake of productivity, right? So
oh,
it's right. So
wow.
it all kind of keeps looping back in. Like we are such a part of a thoroughly capitalist system, right?
Hmm.
That we take even the sacred, right, and try to make it serve our productivity. And
Wow.
I have been, you hear me talk a lot about networks a lot, and in a very interesting book that that I recently read about working with complexity, decentralizing was actually a book called
Mm,
Team of Teams by
mm.
Stanley McChrystal, like the general, right, of the special ops
Oh,
during the war.
wow.
So of all people, think about like a very hierarchical organization and system, right? And
Hmm.
one of the things he says a lot is we were the most efficient system, right? Going back to like productivity, but but not the most adaptable. And
Mm,
if we were to make adaptability central, we actually had to give up some of our attachment to efficiency, right? To linearity.
right.
And so there's something there for us too, right? Like there is a way in which we gotta
Hmm.
meet a barrage of violence that's being done to our communities.
Right.
Um, but we need to do it from an adaptive, right? From an adaptive
Hmm.
lens as opposed to like industrial kind of
Yeah.
big machine meets big machine stance, you know?
Or even reactive. I think that's what we usually see, that we're just going around in circles from one crisis to another. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is to be nimble, the ability to be nimble, the ability to be flexible, the ability to be adaptive, as you said. These are all, I think, traits and characteristics of organizations and movements that build power and that get us to the wins that we want. But we've all heard this, right? The nonprofit industrial complex, the nonprofit sector has been captured by a lot of capitalist viewpoints and trends and frameworks. And so it's not surprising to me that people are really thinking about, I got to go from one campaign to another in the same way that folks think about making widgets after widgets after widgets. It also, I think, really takes away creativity. Like the new ideas, the innovative ideas, right, that people have often don't come from the nonprofit sector as they should, I think, because of this pressure cooker that people are in around productivity and purity and all of that. So I do think that we need a sea change in terms of our movement culture, in terms of leadership, in terms of a set of values that actually should connect us back to our cause and our purpose.
That's right. That's right. Amen. I am right there with you on that. I can't let go of your mention when we're talking about movement culture of purity and the relationship to wokeness and the relationship to personality culture. It's all seems to have a kind of shiny object quality to it. Something around like it all feels very surface, right? It all feels kind of performative. And it therefore also feels brittle, right? I sometimes think that we're performing wokeness because we are actually creatures of belonging. We want to belong. We want to know that we're in the right tribe. And so we are sending we're like shooting out these flares, right? So that we can be recognizable as being in the in group. Hey, I'm in. Don't exile me. I need to belong here. And then you start getting into like a competition for purity, right? And like the call out is a way of signaling that you're part of this thing, that you're not gonna kick somebody out before you get kicked out, actually, right? And so it's like there's like a belonging, a need to belong, but it's actually quite brittle because everybody's terrified of being exiled by making the next mistake, and I think of the crisis of our culture at large, not just of the movement, of the culture at large, as a crisis of meaning and a crisis of connection, right? And I feel like the movements that will actually succeed, right, are not the movements that can be the purest and most woke, but the ones that can do the best job of helping people feel like they belong, that they're connected to each other, and like they're part of a story that is so much greater than ourselves or even this historical moment. You know what I mean? A making story, a human story.
That I think that's powerful, and I agree, and I think that's why the solidarity work is really a place where some of that can be experimented with, because it, inevitably, when you're working in a coalition or when you're working with different communities, you have to be adaptive, you have to innovate, and you have to be nimble and very flexible. And it's also a work that's super messy, right? I mean, there's a lot of issues that come up around conflict and credit and control and all of that are very ego focused. So I think this ability to, as you said, bring people together to find that connection between human beings or communities is a critical underlying outcome of solidarity work. But I also think that it happens when we have a process of self-reflection and self-awareness and self-analysis that oftentimes we don't take time to do, either as individuals or as organizations even. And I think that's something that we really need to build into our movement spaces as well.
It's you're so awesome to interview. You like keep giving me my next question. I actually was thinking about this one next, which is how what are you doing? How do you resource yourself? How are you
Yeah.
self reflecting? Like, what is your practice? How do you stay
Well, I have to tell you that
anchored?
I think that for much of my time as an executive director, I didn't really engage in as much self analysis and self reflection as I could have or should have. And with that, I made a lot of mistakes. I made a lot of errors in judgment. I think that I bought into and probably expressed a lot of these tendencies that we were talking about around purity and productivity and performance in particular. And the reason that I didn't do it is not because I'm not a self reflective person. I actually am very much so and always been so. But I think in that space where you feel that your communities are constantly under attack and you only have this like moment to make a difference, um, the space and time for doing that doesn't happen. That's why I'm such a big believer in things like sabbaticals and retreats and coaches and mentors, because I think that those will check those ways, those approaches, those people check us, and they put a mirror to us. Um, so now, now that I'm no longer an executive director, I've had more time to think about this, obviously, and reflect on myself and assess the mistakes I made. But the way that I resource myself is through some of those practices. I do have a group of people who are not yes people, but who actually say very clear things to me about, I think you're doing this out of FOMO, or you don't have to you don't have to go there, you don't have to do this, you don't have to say that. What is your goal? What is your motivation? They press me to ask myself that question around meaning that you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a group of people like that. And then I also have
Nice.
coaches, that have been with me for some time that I lean on for wisdom. And I also have a practice of journaling.
Beautiful.
And I pause now before I act, or I try to. This doesn't always happen when I'm with my child, but it happens when I try to have it happen when I'm dealing with issues or community, co-leaders and the like, to actually take a breath and pause.
Beautiful. Can you tell me? Can you describe your journaling practice for us? How do you go about it?
Yeah, a couple of different ways. I mean, I make it a point to, even if it's something very short, like words instead of a long narrative, to try to reflect on something that came up for me in a week that just didn't intuitively feel right. So it could be something I said to someone on a call. It could be an email I sent, or a response I got from someone else, just to take a little bit of time to reflect on it and write out my reactions to what it was. So that sort of journaling practice is very simple and it doesn't take a lot of time, but it just helps me to, again, take a breath, take a pause, and look back. And then I assess it, right, with the lens of someone who has been doing this work for some time. Or I take it to my mentors or coaches if I need a little bit more analysis around it.
That's awesome. I'm a huge fan of writing as a practice.
Yeah.
I do morning pages regularly, which is just
Oh, that's
stream of
great.
consciousness,
Yes.
And I never look back actually, but it seems to organize my
Mm-hmm.
thought. I feel like if I were to sit down, when I try to sit down to be as reflective as you're describing, sometimes I freeze. Like, oh, I got to remember this and I got to remember that, and I got to catch it right. But the morning pages,
That's a great idea.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
just like that, and
You
that
don't want to
writing with
put too much pressure on yourself, right? I think that's the
right.
thing. Yeah.
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 Yeah, I love it when listeners kind of learn tips and tricks from people like you. So thank you. I just have a couple more questions, but I want to ask you about facilitation because that is the game that I'm most passionate about. It's what a lot of our listeners are intrigued by. What is like what? How do I ask the question? Like the first one is like, what is your philosophy or your approach, and then yeah, anything you want to share about your practice.
Yeah, well, I've learned a lot from you, Gibrán, and watching you and being in space with you. And I think that that's so important as one develops their practice, as you say, of facilitation, to learn from others.
Right.
And you're one of those people that I've definitely learned from. I think my practice is very much to be in service to the group and their
Yeah.
goals, right? And so I do a lot of prep work to understand what people in a particular space want to get out of that conversation. I also do some prep work in understanding who they are. I look them up, I read their bios, I try to see if they've got a social media presence, what they've been thinking about recently and talking about. So I do a little bit of work to understand people. So I don't walk in with a blank slate usually. Um, and then I think in the space, and this is something, I mean, I'm still learning, obviously, I don't have it all figured out. I tend to make sure that there's a lot of time taken in the beginning because I feel like the first 2 hours of facilitation can set the tone for a successful, discussion or conversation. And the first 2 hours are really about setting community agreements. How are we
Hmm.
going to be in connection to each other? Because if relationship building is really the cornerstone of any successful conversation or discussion, how are we going to engage in that? And who are we trying to be? Who are we aspiring to be as a group? So we're not just individuals, we're here as a group. So setting those community agreements is important. And also, and I think something that I've learned from you is really focusing in on who we are as individuals. And I think you talk
Hmm.
about that when you say accessing the heart element. And I think that that's
Hmm.
really important, so that people feel seen. They feel like they can speak about themselves in their fullness and bring their full selves into space. So I really do really focus in on the first 2 to 3 hours. And then I think it kind of can flow.
Yeah.
You're just
Yeah.
there to be a
Yeah.
guide,
That's
right?
beautiful.
Um, and
Yeah.
to kind of synthesize what the conversations are. Oh yeah,
I'm glad you said that at the end. You are so good at bringing it all together. It is beautiful to watch you do that. I learned from you on that front for sure. It's like it's a very strong skill, very, very, very important, and people love it. People need it, so it's
thanks.
big
Yeah, well, I
service.
think it's a way for me to just organize. Also, I mean, that's probably the lawyer in me that comes out to be like, okay, what are the 3 points that came up here? That folks need to remember and keep
Wow.
in mind. Yeah. Um, but I really enjoy facilitating. I'm still learning how to be a strong facilitator. I think the things that I'm still learning about that I haven't fully figured out are, dealing with conflict in a facilitation space.
Hmm.
Also, kind of understanding when to intervene and when to not intervene. Um, those kinds of situations, I think, are harder for me, and I'm still trying to figure out how best to hold space so that it
That's
serves
great.
everyone in those situations.
Well, steadfast on your journey. The last time I was with you, I definitely saw you rocking it. So thank you. I think one of the things I like, and like everything, it comes with its complications. But I do like that just it's just more understood as a field and a skill. I mean, I'm in all these rooms where people say, I'm this and I'm a facilitator, I'm that and I'm a facilitator. And
Mm,
I think that's a net positive. I think it's sometimes bad when like anybody's calling themselves a facilitator and they're not. I but I think overall it's a very powerful thing, that people are like stepping into that and getting that the only way
mhm.
forward is together, and there's going to be some of us that need to step into the role of helping that happen, helping us come together.
Yeah,
um
I absolutely
so
agree. I
thank you for
agree.
taking it on and for doing it so well. I have two other questions for you, and they might feel like they're out of left field in a way, but one of them is one of them is in this moment, right? This moment, let's call it a post Me Too moment, right?
Hmm.
And it's a moment in which the pain and the horror that women have been facing forever has kind of come out to the for the public glare, right? Like it's hard to speak of it because you don't want to be like, oh, now this has been happening, but now we can't hide from it anymore, right?
Hmm.
And I have this commitment to myself when I'm talking to a powerful woman, as a man, as somebody that's a participant in patriarchy, somebody that has caused harm, that has made these mistakes. I like to ask. I feel responsible to ask. What do you think men should do? Right? Like what? Yeah, I don't even want to couch the question further. Like, what would you say to men listening to this that are just kind of trying or wanting to meet this moment?
Hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. I think that part of it is to actually do, and I think this has been a theme in our conversation, do some of the self work,
Hmm.
right? Of acknowledging and understanding the impact of patriarchy on oneself as a man, right? How how men actually reproduce it in their lives, whether it's in relationships, whether it's in being a parent to a daughter, whether it is in terms of their workplace and how they're treating their colleagues, right? And so, really kind of understanding how patriarchy, and this is the same, because white people ask this question often, right? Like, how do I undo um, racism that I feel that I have reproduced? And I think part of it is that the commitment that you mentioned and the self work has to happen. And I think a lot of times women can't play that role, right? Because it takes a lot of emotional labor to be able to guide someone through that process. So I think having that commitment that you mentioned, doing the self work, also I think coming together as men
Yeah.
to talk about this is important. I think another theme in our conversation has been community. And so there is self work, but it can also be happening in tandem with others who have also made the commitment to, as you said, meet the moment, right? So how are they doing it? What are they struggling with? What can you see in them? How do you help one another? So I think that is extremely helpful as well and important. And then the last thing I would say is that we need men to speak up, right? We need men to actually speak up when it is important for them to do so, so that it is not always women that have to meet the moment and speak up. So when a man can be a disruptor, right? And this is even in the roles that in that ecosystem I mentioned, right? So if there's a way to, if you see something at work or if you hear something at work that is disturbing you, right? To speak up and have a conversation with the person who might be biased in some way towards women. If you see, even recently, I noticed this where you might have heard that the comedian Aziz Ansari is a South Asian man, right, who was taken to task by someone last year for sexual harassment. And he came out recently talking about that situation and what, that he's reflected on it and all of that, and has like a show on Netflix. And I noticed that some South Asian men were taking him to task, and I really appreciated it, right? By saying, well, your 2 minutes of reflection are not sufficient, right? When you're also like having a show on Netflix. So actually taking people to task if needed, stepping in and saying something, expressing solidarity for women in this moment is also really important. So those are the three kind of ways I think that men could really be playing a role right now to meet the moment in an authentic way.
Thank you for that, Deepa. That's very powerful and very helpful. I appreciate it. I really, really do. It's meaningful at a personal level for me.
Oh, good.
Um, the last question I'll ask, and then of course anything you want to leave us with, any pearls of wisdom or ways to find you. It takes a little it takes some consent. It's a mild facilitation here, but what I like to do is invite my guests to do a little time traveling, right? And to see if you can imagine yourself a generation from now, and we're gonna call it 20 years, um, and a lot of what you've worked on inside yourself or in the world has manifested. Some of it hasn't. You know what I mean? But but you're in the future, and you're in the future as somebody that has continued to say yes, right? That has gotten somewhere. And you don't have to describe that to me, right? You just got to get there. And then if you can come back in that shape and as that person that has had all of that experience, what advice would you have for yourself? And what advice would you have for us with that 20 years of wisdom embodied?
That's a fantastic exercise. I kind of want to stay in that future for a while.
It's a little quick, a
I
little
know.
quick.
Time traveling in 30 seconds. I think a couple of things I would say. One is to start now, to not wait, to start now. So whatever is important, whatever imbues you and your soul with meaning and purpose, which right at the core, it, to start it, to attend to it, to respond to it. I think that that's one of the biggest messages that I can see and hear from that future self. And then a second is actually, I pictured actually myself in a home that was very open, where there was a table set with a lot of people that would be coming in. And so, what that means to me is a message around don't isolate ourselves, right? Find in a time where I think in the society where disconnection is constant, right? Or we have this mirage of connection because we are on Twitter or Facebook, or we're texting instead of calling each other or dropping in and seeing each other. There's a mirage of connection, but actually we're more than ever, I think, in the words of that one book, Building Alone, right? We're doing everything alone, right? And so I think there's this sense of set the table, invite people in, and there's enough for many, many people. So I think those are the two messages that I would share for myself and for others.
Thank you. Thank you. That is so beautiful. The good wisdom. Really good wisdom. I so welcome it. Deepa, this has been an awesome conversation. I can't wait for people to hear it. And I can't wait to keep working with you on stuff.
Yeah.
Is there
Same.
anything else you want to say? Anything we should know? How do we find you?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I have a website, deepaiyer.com. And on it, folks can find some of the writing that I've mentioned and information about my book, which is called We Too Sing America. I'm also on Twitter at DVIyer, where you can find my disruptive tweets and sometimes enlightening remarks. And the solidarity work is on a website called solidarityis.org. And I, like you, do a podcast on solidarity practice, and that is available to people on iTunes or any platform where you find your podcasts, and it's called Solidarity Is This.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your precious time. And I just look forward to more with you. Many blessings.
Same. Thank you so much for having me on. This was wonderful.
It really, really has been.